Hello everyone, welcome to our lecture series for chapter 24 in your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This chapter is entitled An Affluent Society, 1953 to 1960. This first section is entitled The Golden Age. The focus question for this first section is what were the main characteristics of the affluent society in the 1950s? The United States emerged from the Second World War as the world's predominant industrial and commercial power. The United States used that power to project its influence economically, politically, and culturally around the globe, ushering in a golden age of American capitalism. This so-called golden age of capitalism was marked by numerous technological innovations and rising wages, increasing the standard of living across the board for all classes of Americans. The military industry continued the development of the West and South as Cold War tensions increased military spending and new military installations and bases were established across these generally impoverished areas, bringing in jobs and people. There were also fewer and larger farms at this period due to the increase in agricultural technology and the growth of corporate farms in California, which helped to facilitate an increasing trend of migration from rural to more urban and suburban areas. This general rise in the standard of living and wages sparked a huge boom in residential construction and spending on consumer goods. Much of this new residential construction took place in new planned communities, suburbs that were a manifestation of a new desire of particularly middle and upper class Americans to migrate from densely populated cities to more spacious suburban enclaves. This spurred a housing boom and demand for cars and household appliances. One of the first of these planned suburban communities was known as Levittown on Long Island. The spread of suburbs also facilitated the spread of malls and mall cultures as these new shopping centers were built in the place of the typical urban downtown commercial centers that were the feature and the economic life of most urban areas. Suburbs tended to not have these downtown spaces, and these malls were built to replace the commercial centers in those urban areas with these new indoor commercial centers in suburban areas. The western United States in particular experienced a huge surge in population, industrialization, and commercialization in the post-war years, leading to the emergence of the more modern West that we would recognize today. This phenomenon was particularly pronounced in California, which experienced a huge suburban boom in the 1950s. Most of the growth in the western United States took place in metropolitan areas. These were huge decentralized metropolitan urban clusters united by an increasingly complex web of highways, and very much life came to center around the car, as in order to basically live in these huge metropolitan areas, a car became an absolute necessity. Consumer culture, which really first emerged in the early decades of the 20th century, came to its full fruition in the 1950s as the rising standard of living and wages made access to that consumer culture more readily available to more and broader swaths of the American populace. In this period, the measure of freedom itself became the ability to gratify these market desires, and consumerism replaced economic independence and democratic participation as central definitions of American freedom. More and more, mass consumption itself was seen as a patriotic act. One new technology that quickly captured the hearts and minds of most Americans and rapidly transformed American society and culture was the television set. By 1960, almost all American families had at least one TV in their household, and TV quickly replaced newspapers as the most common source of information. It became the leading leisure activity for most American families, particularly in the evenings. It helped to provide a common set of experience to all Americans, regardless of background, which in many ways did help to unite and homogenize American culture. However, TV programming largely avoided controversy and projected a bland image of middle-class life, what became known as the Ozzie and Harriet syndrome, where these TV programs projected an image of American life that was very much homogeneous and lacking in any sort of polarization, and it really did not reflect the political and cultural realities of American life in the period, but instead projected an image that was very much fantasized and an idealized version of American middle-class life. Although the automobile had been around for over half a century by this point, in many ways, prior to the 1950s, it was still considered a luxury item. Well, thanks to the spread of suburbs and metropolitan areas in this period, the car became part of the standard consumer package and was considered essential for the economic and cultural life of every American. And this spread of the automobile and car culture transformed the daily life in the nation. The interstate highway system was first begun in this period, although it wouldn't be finished until the 1990s. But this interstate highway system transformed Americans' travel habits and altered the American landscape with things like drive-in theaters, fast food establishments, and other roadside attractions that catered to these new traveling and always on the go Americans. In many ways, the car became an icon of freedom itself that symbolized individual mobility and private choice. The 1950s in many ways saw a retrenchment in more traditional American family values and gender roles. With all of the GIs coming home after the war, most women lost most of their industrial jobs after World War II. And most women who continued to work did so part-time to support the family's middle-class lifestyle. The ideal was a heterosexual couple with a breadwinning husband and a wife who remained at home to take care of the home and the children. Speaking of children, the period between 1945 and 1965 saw the phenomenon that became known as the baby boom, as most of these GIs who were returning home after the war very quickly desired to get married and get a stable job and purchase a home to try to capture some sense of normalcy and consistency that was in many ways a response to their traumatic experiences of the war itself. In general, feminism seemed to have disappeared from American life, as most women embraced the resurgence in these more traditional family values and gender roles. Despite some of the advancements in the issues of civil rights for African Americans that occurred in the 1940s, such as the Double V campaign, segregation remained a reality of American life in the 1950s. And this segregation was either by law in the South or by general customary social and economic practice and pressures in the North. And these new suburbs that emerged in the North and the West and even the South retain rigid racial boundaries. Federal agencies continue to finance housing segregation. This practice was actually declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but private banks and housing developers continued to do it anyway, mostly due to continued social pressures for them to do so. The government could not force private businesses to follow the Supreme Court's decision, only the government agencies. So therefore, legally, there was not much the government can do about this private practice of segregation. New developments, including the Levittown development, that first big suburban development that occurred in Long Island, New York, refused to sell houses to African Americans, keeping these suburbs broadly white enclaves. The 1950s did see a new interest in public housing and urban renewal projects. Public housing projects, of course, were designed to give low-cost, affordable housing to the poor, and urban renewal projects were designed to revitalize dilapidated urban areas. However, both of these really can be seen as sort of a double-edged sword, as housing projects were limited to the very poor and increasingly confined to segregated neighborhoods in inner cities. Urban renewal projects typically demolished poor neighborhoods that were located on valuable commercial real estate. Whites in general retreated to the suburbs, while non-whites had to find housing in run-down city neighborhoods, increasing the racial and economic divide in the United States. As alluded to in the previous slide, suburbanization hardened the racial lines of division within the United States, and in many ways, racial exclusion became a self-reinforcing phenomenon, particularly as whites became fearful that a non-white presence in their neighborhoods would destroy property values, adding to the social and economic pressures to maintain segregation within these communities. In general, Cold War affluence coexisted with urban decay and racism, as the money that had previously sustained urban areas left along with the middle and upper class whites for the suburbs. Religious activity and religious identification also saw a surge in this period, and in many ways this surge reflected the strong anti-communist streak within American politics and ideology of the 1950s. Communism was an atheist ideology that rejected religion. So this new embrace of religion in American culture and society was a reflection of this opposition to godless communism. In God We Trust was added to American money in 1957, which reflected both this new embrace of religion and this anti-communist streak. Religious tensions between different religious denominations became absorbed within a new idea of a common Judeo-Christian heritage, which was an attempt to unite Catholics, Protestants, and Jews under one big umbrella. However, despite this surge in religious activity and identification, free enterprise and economic success was more and more seen as the common religion for all Americans, regardless of their individual religious identification. Indeed, the rhetoric of free enterprise abounded in this period. And essentially what was meant by free enterprise was a capitalistic economic system resting on private ownership that united the free world, even more so than politics or culture. And the ideal very much was competitive free enterprise, which took the old Adam Smith capitalist economic philosophy of the invisible hand of the market to its logical extreme, and stated that this invisible hand produced the most efficient and most affluent outcomes for all. And free enterprise in the 1950s and beyond rested primarily on consumer capitalism and the freedom of business to pursue profits without any government regulation or interference. This ideal of free enterprise was reinforced by media, schools, and government programs. However, this rhetoric largely ignored the fact that the post-war boom was largely made possible by government policies, and this revealed the ironies of the rhetoric of free enterprise, as it was tax subsidies, mortgage guarantees, infrastructure construction, military contracts, and GI Bill benefits that lifted the economic condition of most Americans, even more so than free enterprise or Adam Smith's invisible hand. The ideals and rhetoric of free enterprise was reinforced in this period by the rise of a new conservative political ideology, libertarianism. Libertarians were opposed to a strong national government. To libertarians, freedom meant individual autonomy, limited government, and unregulated capitalism. And really, the first real leader of this libertarian movement was a man named Milton Friedman, an economist who wrote a book in 1962 called Capitalism and Freedom. Friedman identified the free market as the foundation of individual liberty and promoted the repeal of all government involvement in the economy. Libertarianism was not the only new conservative movement in this period. Another strand of conservatism was concerned about moral decay, and this strand of conservatism was dubbed New Conservatism. These so-called New Conservatives wanted government expelled from the economy, but did want it to regulate personal behavior and restore Christian morality. And here lay the origins of a deep division within conservatism. The libertarian streak, which wanted no government involvement in the economy or social mores or morality, and this new conservative streak, which wanted the government out of the economy, but can legislate morality. Two common enemies of both these strands of conservatism were the Soviet Union and the federal government, aka Big Government. And that concludes part 1 of our Chapter 24 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.